everyone. Welcome to Two Bi Guys. We have another awesome interview for you today. My guest is a bi activist, freelance journalist, and writer based in London. We seem to be interviewing lots of writers based in London. There's a lot of bisexuality in London, I think, why it's one of my favorite cities. They are the founder of the Bisexual Survivors Network and the founder of the Do Better By Us campaign, which aims to challenge biphobia. Their writing on bisexuality has been published by The Independent, The Advocate, Diva Magazine, Gay Star News, Into, Openly, and much more. They created and hosted the YouTube series The Ambassadors, along with former Two Bi Guys guest Vineet Mehta. And their first book is called By the Way, The Bisexual Guide to Life. It was published in 2021 by Jessica Kingsley Publishers, and it's great. I just took a look at it. Please welcome to Two Bi Guys, Lois Shearing, finally. Hello, Lo.
Hi. Yes, thank you so much for having me. I have been super excited to come on the show for a really long time. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be chatting. And London is a really bisexual city. We have quite a thriving bi scene here, I think. I'm always really excited to get to talk to people about London's bi community, and my book is actually dedicated to the bi community in London who, as I say in the front of my book, kind of took me under their wing when I was a little 21-year-old when I first arrived in this city and had no friends, no idea what I was doing, found this amazing bi community, found these amazing bi activists who just kind of took in this probably little wide-eyed country bumpkin who looked terrified and sort of, showed me the ropes a little bit. So
Cool. That's awesome. I actually studied abroad in college in London, loved it. It became one of my favorite cities, but I wasn't out for so long and then finally got to come back a couple times after coming out before COVID and really got to explore the queer scene. And yeah, it's thriving. I haven't so much met the bi scene in London because of COVID, but hopefully I will soon. And I also neglected to read in your intro that you run a sewing and crafting group for queer people in London. Maybe not still, but did you used to do that?
I did used to. It's still going as far as I'm aware. I think one of the other co-hosts is still running it. They still run it mainly on Discord. I think it's mostly just a Discord server now. But yeah, that was kind of one of the first kind of bi organizing things I did was set up this sewing circle. It's called Stitch by Stitch. The bi is obviously BI. And yeah, we used to meet monthly in the South Bank Centre and do some sewing together. It was really fun.
That's awesome. I love sewing and knitting. I also do some knitting at home when I have time. Yeah, have you ever done any bi activism without a bi pun in the title? Just
Oh,
kidding.
that's such a good question. Vineet, actually, who you just mentioned, whenever we organize stuff together, he always says, I'm going to leave the name of the event to you because you're going to think of some kind of pun to go with it. And I'm always
Yes.
Stop putting this on me. And then I'll text him half an hour later and be like, we should call it this. And he's like, yes.
Hey, when you found the perfect bi pun, you
Yeah.
got to use it.
It's my
Okay.
talent.
Yes, it's an ability that many bi people share, I think.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, welcome. Great to have you. I want to get into your book and all the topics in the book and the activism you're doing. But as we always do, let's start with you. What pronouns do you use? How do you like to identify? What labels do you use? And then we'll talk a little bit about the journey to get there.
Cool. Yeah. So normally my pronouns are they, she. I'm going through a little bit of a they, them phase at the moment, which I sometimes go through. And then sometimes I'll go back through just a she phase. Sometimes I'll go through an all pronouns phase. As I'm sure we'll cover in this book, I'm a big fan of phases. Sorry, I said in this book, I meant in this podcast. As I'm sure we'll cover in this podcast, I'm a big fan of phases.
Cool.
So I identify as a genderqueer woman, but I also sometimes just use bisexual as my gender identifier as well. And I have a lot of I have a lot of thoughts about bisexuality as gender that we could maybe talk about later.
Interesting.
But yeah, so I kind of use bisexual as my whole label. I've been identifying this way since I was about 14, and now in my late 20s, so it's really just stuck.
Cool. Okay. I definitely want to come back to that quickly because I'm fascinated by bisexuality as gender. Okay, but we
Cool.
got to get there. Tell us about when you were 14 and like how did you realize it? What was that evolution like? When did you start using those terms and coming out?
So I wish I could remember like what my awakening was like when I was in my early teens. I remember I'm someone who like I've always been bisexual, and I've always known on some level that I was attracted to people of any gender. But I went to a Church of England primary school, and I have this really distinct memory of when we had sex education. We then had a vicar come in and tell us that sex was only between a man and a woman who were married. And I very distinctly remember having this memory of being like, oh, you're like, I'm only allowed to be attracted to men. And so everyone else is just attracted to like, the opposite gender. I must be the only one who feels this way. And so I'm just going to tuck that information away and like not ever think about it anymore. um,
Hmm.
and then when I got into secondary school, I did come out quite young. I came out in like year 9, which is about 14. So I don't really know the equivalent in America, maybe like middle school. Um, and I wish I could remember like how I got from tucking away that information to then like being like, yes, I'm bisexual. Um, I think it was quite a long journey, which involved my art teacher in year 7, who was
Oh
a
yeah.
woman, and I was not into art. I'm really bad at art, but I was like, I just want to be so good at art. I just love art, and I want my teacher to like me so much, and I just like couldn't work out why. And now I look back and I'm like, oh, I had a crush on my art teacher.
Hmm.
Um, and then like a lot of people who came out as queer in like the early 2000s, I think it involved a lot of typing like 2 girls kissing into YouTube very late at night. And then like eventually, yeah, I kind of came out at about 14. I was like in very much deep in like the emo subculture. Um, and so I think that made it easier for me to come out at the age I did, because like emo as a subculture was very bisexual. um,
Uh-huh.
and so like a lot of my friends were also identifying that way. And like some of them still do, some of them went on to identify as straight, some of them went on to identify as gay. I stayed with bisexual. So yeah, that's kind of how I got to that point.
Cool. Okay, and then so I guess now tell me, I'm curious about bisexuality as a gender, and I guess like how did your conception of your sexuality and or gender change from, you realized it, you started coming out, and then to now? How has it evolved?
It's quite hard to conceptualize like bisexuality as gender. It's something I've only really been thinking about in the last kind of like year or so. And it's kind of like my sexuality is very fluid. And for me, the word that best describes that is bisexual. And my gender is
Uh,
also very fluid. And so I use like gender fluid to kind of sum that up. But I also don't think I can separate my bisexuality from my gender fluidness, and my gender fluidness from my bisexuality. I think the two are very interlinked.
mhm.
Um, and I think as well, like in my book, I think I described myself as a bit of like a gender chameleon, that I often find myself, and this probably has a lot to do with like neurodivergency as well. I often find myself like mirroring the like gender expression of the people that I'm into.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of like how I have come to this idea of like bisexuality as gender. And the way that I relate to kind of the people that I'm dating is often through this lens of bisexuality. And I consider my own gender like through that lens when I'm relating to them. And I was just very inspired by, I have some friends who kind of talk about their gender identity as being lesbian,
Huh.
because obviously like queer women have a different understanding of womanhood to straight women, because in our very like patriarchal society, womanhood is often dictated in relation to men. Whereas if you're a lesbian and you've chosen to completely opt out of existing in relation to men, obviously your conceptualization of womanhood changes as well. And I feel that way as well, that like my
Yeah.
womanhood in its relationship to both like patriarchy and to men is influenced by my bisexuality.
Mm-hmm.
But also I just find a lot of power in that. Like I know a lot of people who just use queer as their gender identity as well as their
Uh-huh.
sexuality, or who use like lesbian or dyke as just like their gender identity.
Huh.
Um, and it just felt like it made sense for me as well, that like bisexual is such an important term for me that it just kind of encompasses my gender as well.
That's really interesting. It's like we haven't really talked about it in this way on this show yet, but it makes so much sense because I do think that sexuality and gender are very tied together,
Yeah,
especially as like gender gets more fluid, especially within one person, then it's almost like that necessarily affects your sexuality because the sexuality is about your gender and potential genders of other people. So that
for
like
sure.
I identify as a man. I've had thoughts like, am I non-binary, maybe I'm a little gender fluid, but I don't feel like I'm non-binary. I feel like a cis man, but I do feel like bisexual is related to my gender. Like I'm a
Hmm.
bisexual man and it's different than before. And I do feel like my masculinity is different than a straight man. So I like that. That's interesting.
And I do feel like, I mean, something that's like a very biphobic notion of bisexuality is this idea that it like destabilizes gender because it kind of blurs the lines between like male and female, if we pretend those are the only two genders. It
Uh-huh.
blurs like distinction by finding men and women similar enough to be attracted to both of them. And so I think like once you have started to like blur that distinction in your sexuality, it also becomes quite hard to keep them very rigidly separate within your own gender identity. And so I think for me, like being bisexual and being able to relate to people of different genders in all the different ways that bisexuality has also made it much harder for me to be like, what is the box of woman? What is the box of man? Why can't I just have a little bit of everything? We are greedy as
Right.
as
Right.
bisexuals, and I decided to just be all the genders as well.
Right. Well, and it's also that thing of like when I'm attracted to someone, it's a little bit of like I want to be with that person, but I also kind of want to
Hmm.
be that person. And
Yes,
like, oh, if something is interesting or attractive to me, I'm gonna start thinking about it for myself too. And so, they've definitely affected each other. And like I almost wish the term non-binary could be a sexuality. Like it's
mm,
sort of more used as a gender term, but with all this bi pan debates that all this sometimes I feel like it's nonsense going back and forth, like defining things is because we're all like basically in the same umbrella. Like to me, the term non-binary as a sexuality is very broad and all encompassing. It's like anything other than straight, gay, lesbian. So
for
I don't
sure. And
know.
I do know the academic Meg John Barker has kind of used non-binary in that way.
Mm,
Um, their book Life Isn't Binary kind of talks about non-binary sexualities to include kind of like bi, pan, queer. But also just going back to what you said about when we're attracted to people, you kind of start to emulate them a little bit. I think the scholar Lil Nas X sums it up quite well in his lyric, "I want to fuck the ones I envy."
yep.
So that's a big gender mood as well, you know?
Yes, exactly. Let's talk about productivity. I struggle with this. I have a million projects that I'm working on. I often feel overwhelmed, and yet I also find it difficult, especially working from home, to get to work for a full day, hour after hour, and to keep it going. I definitely burn out, especially if it's like writing or something creative. It's hard to stay in the zone. I need to take lots of breaks. I do use coffee to keep it going and to stay awake and to stay focused. But to be honest, the longer into the afternoon I'm having coffee, it doesn't feel so great. I get that jittery feeling, I get that acid reflux. I just don't feel great. So when I got this sample of Magic Mind, I was definitely skeptical at first. It's this tiny little shot. I didn't really think it could make that much of a difference, but it really is kind of magical. I take it with the first cup of coffee or soon after. I don't need to keep having the coffee well into the afternoon. And somehow I am much more focused and able to sit at the computer without it feeling like I'm forcing myself to do that. Like I get in that zone much more since I've been using Magic Mind. Magic Mind has all sorts of cool ingredients. It's got a lot of matcha, which contains way less caffeine than coffee, but also additional compounds called catechins. Is that, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. Who knows? But they extend the benefit of caffeine by slowing your body's ability to absorb it. And it also has a chemical called L-theanine, which reduces stress. It has Bacopa monnieri, a nootropic that improves your attention span, your ability to process and learn new information, and your memory. And it has ashwagandha, an adaptogen that reduces stress and anxiety. It also has other things. It has lion's mane mushrooms. That's easy to read. Another nootropic and adaptogen that reduces anxiety and inflammation while also supporting cognition. So many things. There's even more that I won't pronounce. So I highly recommend Magic Mind. I have a 20% off code to share with you guys. It is ByGuys20. So to use it, you go to magicmind.co/ByGuys and enter code ByGuys20. The best part is they have a money back guarantee. And if you get the subscription, it's 40% off for the next 10 days. So it's 20% off any order, money back guarantee, 40% off a subscription, magicmind.co/ByGuys, promo code ByGuys20. So your writing is everywhere. You're writing about bisexuality. It's all over. And looking at the list of topics you covered, it's vast. And you've been doing it for a few years now. So I'm curious, like, how you got started writing queer and bi content. Like, was that your goal to be writing about queerness and bisexuality, or did you kind of fall into it and it grew naturally?
I definitely fell into it when I first started doing freelance journalism. So I did journalism at university, and I started freelancing in my third year. And I was originally doing like rural affairs content because I'm a little country bumpkin. So I was writing about like equestrianism and farming and that kind of stuff. So if you go really far back if you Google my name and go really far back, you'll eventually find like a load of rural affairs stuff. It's quite funny. Um,
Cool.
but then I did my dissertation at university on this is such a wordy like title. It was how non-monosexual identities were represented in the news coverage of the UK same-sex marriage law.
Yeah. We could do a whole podcast on that dissertation, I think. Okay.
It wasn't good. So I did my dissertation on that, and that was kind of how I first started reading academically about bisexuality. I'd been like very heavily involved in like bi Tumblr for like a lot of my teens. So then for my dissertation, I started reading, all of this academic work that was out there about bisexuality, and it just like resonated with me so deeply. Just like the scholarly stuff about bisexuality just seemed to align so well with my just general politics. And so I started writing for a little blog called The Queerness, which is amazing and everyone should check out. Just literally I think this is a bisexual thing. And then it just kind of escalated from there, really. And I just, kept thinking about it, kept writing about it. Just, I could not be shut up, basically.
Great. Perfect. And like, how do you juggle writing for so many different mediums and platforms? And like, is that your full-time job or is it a side gig, or how do you look at it?
At the moment, it's a side gig. I have a full time job as a content writer for an education agency. Eventually, it might be quite nice for it to be my full time gig. But yeah, at the moment, I'm just kind of freelancing a lot, and I just sort of pitch at like anywhere basically and just hope somewhere picks it up. And quite a few places have picked up a lot of what I've written about bisexuality. So that's really
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, you were like slightly ahead of the curve of like there has been a kind of an explosion lately, but
Hmm.
it's very recent. Has your writing on this subject changed over time? Like when you look back at what you wrote a few years ago versus the kind of things you're thinking about now, how has it evolved?
I think it's less apologetic. And what
Hmm.
I mean by that is I think I used to really write from a place of like, bi people do exist and we do have issues, please listen to us.
Yeah.
Whereas now I write from a place of like, these are the things that mattered to like bi people and to our community. This is what we need to be doing, or this is what I think we need to be doing. But also like I feel like I've just kind of, I mean, you describe it as like bi 2.0 topics.
Yeah.
I feel like I've kind of moved past the writing of like 5 issues that affect the bi community or like things not to say to a bi girl. Not that those articles aren't important, and now I sometimes get approached to like give quotes for them, and I always really enjoy that. But I much prefer writing about things like bisexuality as gender, or how would we better conceptualize queerness if we stopped pretending that bi people were always riding on the coattails of queer culture and acknowledge that like a lot of bi celebrities build queer culture.
Cool.
Um,
That's awesome.
so I think that's what I mean by less apologetic.
Yeah. That makes sense. I feel like when I started talking about this stuff too, that it was like almost defensive in a way at first of
Mm,
like, because I had felt so much shame and stigma and being told it wasn't real, that like the first kind of push was like, it is real and it's valid and it's okay. And like we kind of did that a lot, season
yeah.
one of this podcast. And then we kind of moved beyond that.
You have to kind of work through the like I kind of think of it as like societal gaslighting almost, that you're saying like
Right.
this is a thing that I'm experiencing and living, and everything around you is saying no it isn't,
Yeah.
you're wrong about that. And you have to kind of get to a place where you can just kind of trust your own experiences
Yeah.
and say like okay, I'm just taking the fact that this is real and this is who I am and this matters as a baseline, and we're going to go from there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think it's most bi people go through a similar evolution. And so like when I go back and listen to some of season one of this podcast, I'm like, oh God, I sound different. I'm not talking about it the same way. I'm a little defensive, but that's why I don't go back and listen much. But I do think it's like valuable for people who are new to this and looking for stuff for the first time, like to read an article about bisexual people exist, or here are 5
Hmm.
things that are biphobic. Like that is important for the newbies. But
It
if you're
absolutely.
but if you're listening to season 5 of Two Bi Guys, we can get into 2.0 stuff.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like you've written about being diagnosed as dyslexic. How has that affected your work as like a professional writer? How do you overcome that challenge in your
Yeah,
work?
it's affected my work as a professional writer in my day job several times. I've had to, I think I mentioned in like the intro to my book that I had to, midway through writing it, I experienced like workplace discrimination because of my dyslexia and had to leave my job. And that was like the second time that had happened to me. But JKP were amazing. Like when I had my first meeting with Andrew, who was my editor at the time, one of my questions to him was like, I'm dyslexic. How would like I'm worried that I'm going to turn something into you and you're going to be like, this is unreadable. And he was like, A, that's not going to happen because I've already like read a lot of your content, and B, they actually they do a lot of work on a lot of books on neurodivergency, and so they'd already worked with dyslexic writers, and they had editors who knew how to work with dyslexic writers. I mean, one of my favorite notes that I got back all throughout the book was like every time I'd spelled bisexual wrong, they had to highlight it and be like, "Are you referring to something else here?" And I just had to like put down this blanket thing of like, "No, it's just a lot of vowels in the word bisexual, and they move around for me." So right now, I'm writing a book about fascism, and I keep spelling the word fascism wrong, so that's fun as well. Um, but yeah, for the book, being dyslexic obviously does affect my writing career quite a lot, but luckily not with JKP. So I'm really grateful for that. It was a really great like first experience.
Awesome. Cool. Well, so that leads right into it. So let's get into the book. And before we do talk about the topics in it, I'm curious about Jessica Kingsley Publishers and how did you decide you wanted to write this book? How did you go about pitching and selling it? Like, tell us about that process, because I'm in the middle of a similar process.
Okay,
So
cool.
I'm
Oh my
picking your
God.
brain here a little.
Okay, so you're gonna not like my answer then.
Uh-oh.
So I had always I'd been writing a lot about bisexuality, and I knew that down the line I would want to write a book about it. I had thought about maybe doing a book of essays, but I had actually written a children's book, a queer children's book that I was pitching around, and someone I know who's also published with JKP, their book is called Ace to Z, and it's like a dictionary of queer terms. They suggested that I pitch it at JKP, and they helped me go through that process of pitching it. And then again, Andrew got in touch with me and said that they weren't interested in children's books at the moment, but they were doing a series on LGBT issues for the teen market, and they were looking for someone to write the B section, and that they'd seen my portfolio, and would I be interested in writing a book for teenagers about bisexuality instead? And I said yes, I would love to do that.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah, and originally I went in with this really this is no shade to Andrew. I love Andrew if he's ever listening to this. But I went in with these really dense notes about, I was like, I want to write a book about biphobia specifically, and kind of mechanisms of biphobia and how it works. And I opened my notes and I said, okay, so as you know, bi people often feel discriminated against by both gay and straight people. And Andrew said, oh, really? I didn't know that. And then I shut my notes, and I was like, okay, this is actually the book I'm going to write for you. And kind of pitched the FAQ thing that it turned out being.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that, and I think there's room in the world for a book about biphobia. I'd love to read it, but that it makes sense. Sometimes we forget that there is a lack of baseline knowledge about
Mm-hmm.
bisexuality from most of the world. I'm in a bi
Yeah.
bubble sometimes, and then you meet a regular person, they don't even know that, right? And so your book is
Yeah.
really a great primer on sort of all the most important foundational things
Oh,
about
thank you.
bisexuality. This episode of Two Bi Guys is sponsored by BetterHelp. Give online therapy a try at betterhelp.com/2biguys and get on your way to being your best self. You know, when I was starting to realize I was bi and starting to come out, I kind of wished there was a user manual for this experience. Thankfully, these days there are more and more books being published, but there is no user manual for each of us individually because we're all experiencing this in a completely new way, and how could there be? But there is the next best thing, which is therapy. Therapists are trained to help you figure out the cause of challenging emotions and learn productive coping skills, which makes therapy the closest thing to a guided tour of the complex engine called you. So whether it's coming out as bi or navigating your gender, or completely separate things like a career change, a new relationship, becoming a parent, therapy can help you navigate all of life's challenges. I personally have benefited greatly from therapy. I've been in therapy for probably about 5 years now. I've learned to deal with trauma. I've learned coping skills. I've learned how I tend to think about things in patterns and how I can break out of those patterns. And I was lucky. I have been with the same therapist for a while who I got through a recommendation. But if you don't have that, or that's hard to find, BetterHelp can be a great option. As the world's largest therapy service, BetterHelp has matched 3 million people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists, available 100% online. Plus, it's affordable. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist, and if things aren't clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. It couldn't be simpler. No waiting rooms, no traffic, no endless searching for the right therapist. Learn more and save 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/2biguys, TWOBIGUIS. That's betterhelp, HELP.com/2biguys. So let's talk about those things.
Cool.
A lot of it is stuff we've talked about on this show, and there's like lots of great basics. Here, wait, let me read some of the chapter headings if I can find it, just to give people an idea. Am I bi? What if I have a preference? Does bisexuality reinforce the gender binary? When should I come out? What's it like dating for bi people? Okay, so all great stuff, and everyone can find all the answers to those questions in the book, except for am I bi, as you write. You can't answer that for people. But if they read the book, they'll have a better idea. Okay, but I read it and I honed in on some sort of things I thought were really interesting and thought provoking. Some 2.0 stuff. So the first thing was this concept of being really bi. Are you really bi? Quote. And I'm going to read something you wrote because I just thought it was a great, sort of intro to this. You wrote, lots of people, even if they've been out as bi for years, like me, still often find themselves questioning whether they are really bi or bi enough. In my 11 years of being out and interacting with the bi community, I found that this is probably the most unifying bi experience. The world around us isn't great at recognizing or celebrating bisexuality. Every bi person I know has been asked at some point in their lives if they're sure they're not actually gay or actually straight based on their dating history, normally more than once. So, I mean, yeah, like I've heard that so often in my own life, but I hadn't heard it talked about as like the most unifying bi experience, but I think it may be. So, can you just talk about your experience with that and why you wrote that?
Yeah, I really don't think I've ever met a bi person who something we haven't connected over or talked about is just like that question. Like it just comes up all the time. Like, are you really bi? Are you sure you're not this? Are you sure you're not that?
Uh-huh.
And like so much of our discourse as a community is also about feeling bi enough or like not feeling like we're queer enough, and like that has to come from somewhere. Like that can't be all of us sharing the same like insecurity. Like it comes from the culture around us that says actually you'll settle down with one or the other, or you'll realize this along the way. So I do think that's one of the most like unifying bi experiences, is that constantly having to like reassert yourself and come out again and assure people like yes you're sure. um
Yeah.
and so yeah, that's kind of why I think it's like something that connects all of us and brings us all together, is this constant like having to really push about our identity.
I totally agree, and I think, as you wrote, it also highlights just how binary the culture we live in is, and just how uncomfortable most people are with the concept of fluidity, because it is difficult to categorize, and
Mm.
we like to categorize things, and so that's why I think most bi people, have heard those things and feel that pressure.
Yeah, I think my most like salient example of it happening to me was when I was a teenager. I dated a man for 5 years, and then immediately after that, in my early 20s, I dated someone who at the time identified as a woman for like 4.5 years. So I was nearly perfectly 50-50 in my only dating experience. And like still, like immediately after that, people would hear this and be like, yeah, but like, which one do you prefer? Or like, which way are you really? And I was like, I've nearly reached like the bi equilibrium that we're supposed to all strive for, and yet you're still asking me this question.
Yeah.
So
That's wild, because yes, people always think it's this 50-50, and so then it's like even even when you're there,
yeah,
the
even
question,
if you do
so
it,
it's
it's not enough.
so it's really not about that. It's really about this some sort of discomfort with duality or something. Actually,
Mhm.
I'm jumping two questions down. This was literally my question was, why do you think so many non-bi people have trouble understanding that it doesn't have to be a 50-50 split, that like we can still have preferences and experience attraction differently over time, or like fluidity? Why do you think people have such trouble with that? I don't know if you can really answer for all the other
Yeah.
people out there, but
I think people love to be able to categorize things, and I think it's like a survival tactic. I think I talked about this a bit in the beginning of my book, that like it has been a very useful survival tactic to be able to say like, that thing is orange and stripy. I don't have enough time to also see if it has like big paws and big teeth. I'm just going to run away because it's a tiger. And so I still think there is like this slight impulse to need to like categorize things, and that's why we end up with a lot of like the internal biases that we have, not just towards like queer people, but towards like people of color and disabled people and all of these kind of things. And I do think, yeah, particularly for bi people, we do kind of elude that conceptualization a little bit.
Mhm.
And again, we make it harder for like people to ascertain like their straight privilege because, as I always say this person's name wrong, it's Yoshino, who wrote the Epistemic Contract of Bisexual Erasure, um,
Hmm.
talks about how if you see a man who talks about how much he loves his wife, but then you find out he's also sleeping with men, then you could have accidentally given straight privilege to someone who doesn't deserve it, and that's very threatening to our culture. So I think a lot of it comes from like the threat that we as bi people pose to like heterosexual patriarchal ideals that a man will love a woman and only a woman, and that makes him a real man.
Right.
And so I think that's why like people are so uncomfortable with bi people like crossing over these boundaries that we're not supposed to.
Right. That's really interesting and it makes sense. Yeah, it is like dismantling these pillars of
Mm-hmm.
patriarchy. You also write in the book about bisexuality as freedom, quote. Can you explain what that means to you?
Yeah, so that's a Juno Jordan quote. She was an amazing poet who wrote a lot about bisexuality. I think that's mine, and I know it's several other people's like favorite quote about bisexuality. For me, it just kind of, yeah, it means like not having to choose. It means having like more options. I know that like the respectable thing that bi people are meant to say is like, oh well, we don't really have more options, and like it's just as hard dating, and that is true. But I do also enjoy having more options. I do also. I think I don't know if I talked about this in the book or if I just talked about it somewhere else, but like one of my favorite places to be bisexual is on the tube here in London. I love getting on the tube and being like, she's cute, he's hot, blah 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 blah. Like
Uh-huh.
it's fun, it's freedom, it's like possibilities, it's not having to put myself in boxes that I don't want to put myself in. It's like not having to ignore these like borders that have been put around my identity by other people.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I like about the phrase bisexuality is freedom.
I love it too. I love that freedom to choose. And we get that biphobia of like, why can't bi people just like decide and make a choice? And it's like, I make lots of choices. It's just
Mm-hmm.
that's what I like is making lots of choices, not just one choice to live
Yeah.
with for the rest of my life, but like continuing to see where I'm at and what I want and making a new choice today that I didn't make yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
It's very freeing and you don't get locked in.
For sure.
Cool. Okay, I really liked this chapter or topic about essentialism and as we're talking about like choices and choosing and like so you write about how biphobia and transphobia can grow from essentialism, which is this idea that our identity is innate rather than a choice. And you write that this born this way narrative, which is kind of what I grew up hearing about in terms of gay and lesbian people, that it's left a lot of queer people out in the cold. So I'm curious, how do you view this conflict between the innateness of our identity versus choosing? Because I think it is complicated for bi people. Like it's our, feelings are not a choice, but sort of coming out is more active of a choice, or transitioning is a more active thing you have to choose. It doesn't just happen. So how do you view that?
Yeah, I mean, I might use the other F word here again because I've been writing and thinking about fascism a lot recently, and I think essentialism ties really closely to fascism. And so I've been thinking a lot about biphobia and fascism recently, which maybe isn't good. Um, but
Sounds great to me.
so the kind of like the essentialist argument is that there is something innate within people that makes them the category that they are, and so it depends on like the person making this argument. So for a lot of people, it's like a biological essentialism. So it's if you have certain genitalia or certain chromosomes, then you are a certain gender. And this is also where the like scientific hunt for like the gay gene has come from. That like there must be this unifying thing, this essence of the thing that all the people in that category share. And for other people, and again, I'm thinking about kind of fascism here. It's this like mystical essentialism of like this divine thing that makes someone a woman or a man or whatever. And so again, I think bi people evade that a little bit because like there could be an essence that makes someone attracted to everyone or makes someone attracted to all genders. But it could also be that maybe there isn't an essence that unifies all men, that unifies all women, that unifies all non binary people. And that once you can kind of see past the cultural boundaries put around all of those identities, you realize that you're just interacting with people rather than categories. And that's not to say that like gender isn't real or that sexuality isn't real. Like it absolutely is. But also it's very like bound up in our culture. Like heterosexuality as a concept only started existing a couple of hundred years ago. And like bisexuality and homosexuality, like gayness, followed quite swiftly afterwards as concepts.
Right.
But these things aren't like these divine ideals that we've always been aware of, and they're different depending on like your cultural understanding of gender or your cultural understanding of romantic love.
Absolutely. Let me jump in because like I totally agree. Like these categories that we're brought up with are created by people. They're not real things. And like I think when I started to view sexuality and gender as spectrums rather than distinct categories, like that really conflicts with essentialism. Because if everyone is some dot on a big 3D spectrum, you know, then we're all in the same space, and then these groups we draw circles around the dots to say, okay, these people are this thing and these people are this thing. That's all kind of invented, and that's a choice that our society has made for us. The spectrum it's a spectrum.
For sure. And then the way that kind of links into thinking about right wing concepts or like authoritarian concepts is that once you start creating these binary categories or these very separate categories, we kind of then naturally start ranking them. We put men
Yeah.
above women, we put straight people above queer people, we put able people above disabled people. And
Yep.
if you start removing the like essence of the thing that creates those categories, it becomes a lot harder to rank them.
Yeah. Oh, that makes so much sense. Exactly. So also in the book you wrote on this topic, you wrote, I want to read this because I loved it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying being queer is a choice. I'm saying, so what if it were? Why shouldn't we deserve to have our gender identities and sexualities respected, even if we did choose them? Which I agree with. And I also loved you wrote, some of us don't feel like we were born the way we now identify, and that our sexuality may change and develop even with our input as we grow. So, I mean, it's very well said there, but do you want to
Thank
comment on
you.
that further?
Yeah, I think I mean, Heron Greensmith has done some really amazing writing on the Born This Way narrative and kind of its pros and limitations of, it has been the way that like same-sex marriage and a lot of queer rights have been hard won, especially in the United States. But it also has this limit that we now are held to this standard that if we're not always this thing, if we don't always feel like we're this thing, if we don't feel like it's a core part of who we are or something that we were born with, then do we not deserve those same rights? Like if someone
Right.
their whole life, if a woman their whole life has only loved men and has never even thought about loving women, and then falls in love with a woman and thinks maybe she's just the one off, maybe I only love this woman, does she not still deserve to marry her just because she doesn't necessarily now can consider herself a lesbian or bisexual or anything like that?
Right.
And I do also think that like it gives us more autonomy to be able to say, actually, like maybe I want to disengage with this part of this identity. And lots of people do make choices about how they express themselves or who they date or choose who they. You can't really choose who you fall in love with, but you can choose who you want to pursue.
Right.
So, and I mean, those people deserve rights and freedoms as well.
Yep.
So again, I think it's moving away from this slightly like right wing idea of you only deserve rights if you kind of can always prove you're this thing and where you fit within like the ranking of that thing.
Yeah.
That is not a good scientific explanation.
I love it.
Thank you.
Next topic, let's talk about coming out. You have a chapter on coming out. But I want to hone in on something specific. You wrote about when you first came out, it was to a friend, like a close friend, who then later, a few years later, came out to you as bi. That has happened to me so many times. Like of people I knew from my past who, when I come out, they come out to me, or when I come out a few years later, they come out to me as bi. Why do you think that's such a common experience for bi people?
I don't know if it's just for bi people in particular. I guess for me, like I live in quite a bi bubble, so that is more my experience. But I think
Yeah.
just like, yeah, once you have a friend who starts like living this way and you start seeing the freedoms or like the authenticity that it offers them, it does become just so much easier for you to start like reflecting on your own thoughts and feelings. Like the old phrase, you can't be what you don't see. I think like previously, even for my generation, and I'm not that old, even though people on Twitter keep calling me like a bi elder. I'm in my 20s.
Amazing. I'm like, you're much younger than me, so what does that make me?
Even for like people my age and in my generation who like things are a lot better for us and there was a lot more representation. The like best representation we could hope for was like our friends coming out and living authentically.
Mhm.
So I do just think it's that. I think it's like once you start seeing people living comfortably in themselves, it becomes so much easier for you to reflect on that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and also on this topic of coming out, like, as we know, bi people are the most invisible, possibly in the queer community. We're the least
Mm.
likely to be out. And so that sort of perpetuates this cycle of invisibility and shame and, not coming out. And so at a certain point, I felt like I have to come out. I have a responsibility. But it took me a while to get to that point, and I
Mm.
thought I'd take it to the grave before that. So I'm curious, like, you came out pretty early, so I don't know how you felt about this at the time, but in addition to how you felt, like, how do you view that at a society level? Like, is it important for bi how do you balance the importance of bi people coming out with it's okay to not come out and not pressuring people if they're not ready? And like, how do we balance that? Is it okay to not come out?
That's such a good question of how do we balance it? Because I personally am like, you don't owe anyone coming out. Um, I have a friend, I don't know if she still is identifying this way, but she like would not label her sexuality at all. She was like, it's no one's business. If I fall in love with this person, then that's fine. If I fall in love with this person, it's fine. I'm not telling anyone, like even myself. And I was like, that's so rad. I love that. And like, I hope eventually we can all get to that place where like it just doesn't matter anymore. But
Hmm.
until then, I guess like the way of viewing it is that coming out lets you find community. Like, no two bi people's experiences are going to be the same, but I found that I have more in common with people who call themselves bi than like people who call themselves straight or gay. Although obviously I have a lot more in common with people who are gay, um,
Yeah.
just kind of naturally. And so I guess like the balancing act is there's so many pros to coming out in terms of like mental health when you get to like live authentically and finding community and all that kind of stuff. But then obviously it's just like not possible for some people and no one owes us like they're coming out. I do think there's a lot of like political power in it of saying like I'm going to live as this person regardless of like what I might lose out on, but we can't really make that decision for anybody else. And I guess the
Right.
best we can do is keep like fighting to create an environment where it is easier to come out.
You write in the book about seeing life and approaching relationships, quote, through bi tinted glasses. So I'm wondering if you could explain what that means to you, and do you feel like you're always wearing those glasses, like all the time, or do you ever get a chance to take them off, or do you want to?
I think I may have like recently had just watched BoJack when I wrote that, and I don't know if you've watched BoJack, but
I have, but remind me. I don't
there's
remember.
the kind of the really famous quote where Wanda, one of the ex girlfriends of BoJack, talks about kind of if you look at life through rose tinted glasses and all of the red flags just look like flags.
Uh-huh.
And I think I maybe had that analogy in my head while I was thinking about this. but I do think that like I can't. My experience is bisexual. My internal life is bisexual. My internal desires are bisexual. I can't look at the world in another way. I don't know what it's like to be straight. I don't know what it's like to be gay. I can't look at the world through those experiences. I guess if I was being really pretentious, this kind of goes back to like the epistemic kind of argument and like philosophers that we can only like you can't ever prove that there's a world beyond your own perception, and you can get into some real good solipsism there if you also, like me, happen to have a history of clinical depression. But like I can't experience the world in any other way than as someone who is attracted to all genders. And so every time I have a relationship with someone, regardless of what their gender is, I'm bringing my experience as a multi-gender attracted person to that relationship, whether that relationship is like a friendship or romantic or just a sexual relationship. I can't like bring any other experiences to it because I don't have those experiences. So I think in terms of like, do I ever take off my bi-tinted glasses? I don't really know if I can. I think they're just embedded in there.
Yeah.
But also I like viewing the world in that way. It opens up more possibilities. It opens up my politics as like an anarchist person to look at the world in a way that's not about borders and binaries. Um, Man, I really did get
Yeah.
pretentious with that answer.
I love I love that
But
answer. That's kind of what I was thinking too, of like these glasses. I put them on because of how I see gender and relationships and sexuality, but I still wear them when I look at other things now in my life and my politics and like other issues that are seemingly unrelated, but you look at the world in a less binary way, I feel. So that's why I identified with that a lot.
for sure.
You write in the book about bi community and why it's important. So I want to ask about your experience of finding bi community in London. Like, how did it affect you? And then did it, is that connected to your activist work? Like, how did you get involved in the bi activism you're involved in?
Yeah, so the answer to both those questions is an event called BiFest that up until the pandemic was happening annually in South London. And it was just like a bi fest, like a 1 day bi festival in what do they call a Quaker church? And it was just kind of a day of like workshops and talks and kind of roundtables and stalls and picnics. If it's still going and anyone's like local, I highly recommend it. I think it's been on pause since COVID started, but I went to those like a couple of times when I first moved to London and just loved it. Like met so many cool people, and I went to a workshop that Marcus, who runs the Bisexual Index here in the UK, was running called How to Be a Bi Activist. And we did that workshop. And then at the end of the workshop, we were kind of doing this skills exchange thing where I was like, right, if you have this skill and you want to connect with someone else who wants to do something, then like now's a chance. And I kind of put forward that like I was interested in writing and I wanted to maybe write for like some bi websites. And then Libby, who runs Biscuit, which is a bi advocacy group here in the UK, kind of like grabbed me and was like, yes, you're coming to write for me. And then that was like 5, 6 years ago. And I've done like the majority of my organizing since then with Marcus and Libby. And through them, yeah, I've like found so much more of like the bi community and got involved in loads of different groups. There used to be a group in London called London Bi Pandas, which was a direct action group. They were amazing. Shout out to Fox who like started that and ran it. And yeah, that's just kind of how I got involved. I got involved in activism like before I got involved in community stuff. So I've
Interesting.
been doing like a lot of organizing since the beginning. And now I feel like I found communities that are less about activism and are more about hanging out, just chilling.
Cool. And sewing and knitting.
Hmm.
I feel like sometimes, in many respects, bi activists we end up fighting for sort of basic rights and equal resources and sort of basic level
Mm.
awareness. Why do you think it's so challenging to get that basic level of resources for bi people specifically? And like, what do you think is sort of the next level of bi activism? Like, how do you hope to see the movement grow?
Yeah, I mean, I think I could do like another hour of just talking at you about how like mainstream LGBT organizations have like failed bi people pretty badly,
Hmm.
and are often very happy to take our money but don't want to give it back to our community.
Yeah.
But I won't get too deep into that because that's very negative. But yeah, I feel like we just end up fighting for basic stuff because of like the bi erasure, that not only are there not that many bi people, but that like our experiences are actually just like watered down 50% gay experiences, that we don't have any of our own issues, that we only kind of experience like 50% homophobia or like 50% of the homelessness that gay people face, which actually makes me think of a really good essay in the book Bi Politics, Queries, Theories, and Visions, which I can see on my shelf over there, which is called If Half of You Dodges a Bullet, All of You Dies. And it's about like if you get shot on one side of you, it's not just half your body that dies, it's all of it.
Mm.
Which like if you get hit in the, if we even individualize bi people as like half gay, half straight, which we're not, if someone homophobically attacks the half gay part of you, does the straight part get up and walk away? Like, no, it
Right.
doesn't. And so I think that's kind of, that misconception is why we're still fighting for like our issues to be taken seriously, because we're not seen as having any of our own separate issues of the community. I do think that's
Mm.
changing slightly, and I think it's because of the work of a lot of amazing bi activists who are fighting for stuff like better resources for homeless people, better domestic violence resources, which I obviously think is like one of the main issues facing bi people, and all of that kind of stuff. So I do think it's changing, but yeah, I think it's very slow, and a lot of the LGBT organizations, and again, I think you could even link this to the Born This Way narrative, that bi people are seen as having the option to like choose out of the gay life, that issues have just been taken less seriously and given less money.
Right. It's like, oh, if you're bi and you can choose to not display your queerness, then you should be fine and we don't need to support you. When in fact that attitude causes even more mental distress for bi people because we're so caught in between.
I also, just to add on to that, I also think, if I can be a little bit spicy, that bi people are less palatable to a lot of the liberal donors to these organizations, because I think in a lot of, and I think this is a very American thing, if you don't mind me saying,
Please.
I think a lot of these like American orgs, which dictate a lot of like the general Western conceptualization of queerness, is that like gay people are this kind of like unfortunate desexualized other, whereas like bi people we're seen as unfortunate, but we're a lot less harder to desexualize because we're seen as like greedy. um,
Hypersexualized sometimes.
yeah, for sure, definitely. And so I
Hmm.
think the charity sector, particularly in America, has like taken a lot of the like fangs out of the politicalness of being gay, because they've just kind of said like, they're just one step removed from straight people because they just so happen to, only like men or only like women or whatever, and
Hmm.
they can be made more palatable, which obviously is not true of gay people. Gay people are like very political and very rebellious to like the heteropatriarchy, whereas bi people's issues is a lot harder to make as palatable to straight liberal allies.
Yeah.
That's my slightly spicy take.
Very spicy. I love it. Can you tell us about the Bi Survivors Network and why you created that and what it is and how it's helping people?
Yeah, so the Bi Survivors Network is a support group and an awareness campaign, I guess, organizing around the fact that bi people face much higher rates of sexual and domestic violence than gay or straight people. So for bi women, the statistic is like 2 in 3 bi women are survivors. For bi men, it's something like 50%. And this is like way higher than it is for gay or straight people. There aren't really statistics about non binary bi people. I would really like it if there were some.
Yeah.
So yeah, we run a chat which happens on Telegram every other week, and we also do awareness and like community outreach. We go to Pride and stuff like that. And so I started that in my very early 20s after I got out of an abusive relationship, in which I felt like my bisexuality had played a role in some of the things that I'd experienced in that relationship. And I felt like a lot of the support groups for sexual violence didn't know how to deal with bi people. The mainstream support groups weren't very good on dealing with queer people in general, and the queer support groups didn't really know how to deal with bi people, particularly bi people who had been in like different gender relationships, had experienced abuse, but were still queer and still felt that their queerness had contributed to that. Which now, having run BSN for 5 years, is like a very common experience I've found among people who reach out to us.
Huh.
So yeah, that's what the Bi Survivors Network is. I'm hoping to at some point be able to like produce some reports and stuff and get some more information about bi survivors' experiences. But it's slow going. If anyone wants to volunteer, please DM me on Twitter.
Cool. We'll put some info in the show notes. I'm curious just to follow up, like what when people say their bisexuality may have been related to abuse or bad things in a relationship, like do you have examples of how that could manifest?
For sure, yeah. We actually have just produced a leaflet that has some like red flags that like discusses this of like things to look out for in a relationship and includes like lots of bi people on Twitter kind of answered this call out that I put out about that. And a lot of it like is to do with the stereotypes as bi people as cheaters, bi people as like promiscuous, especially bi women and especially bi people of color who are really hypersexualized and are seen as like always wanting it. That kind of contributes to the fetishization that like bi people don't say no, or that like it's okay to like bi people are exotic and always consenting and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that can really contribute to like rates of sexual violence. And within intimate partner relationships, it could be something like a partner saying to you, well, you can't go out with any of your friends because I can't trust you around men or women, or like I need to look through your phone because you're bi, you're more likely to cheat on me.
Mm.
Like these are kind of just the ways in which like biphobia manifests within like intimate relationships and can turn sour really quickly.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, final thought. We'll end where we started. So we started with sort of talking about how your sexuality and gender identity are kind of interrelated. In the activism space, I think that's an important concept too. Like, how do you see the bisexual community and the trans non-binary communities being interrelated, if they are? And like, why do you think it's important for the bi community to stand in solidarity with the trans and non-binary communities, and vice versa?
For sure, yeah. Like firstly, I think just we need to stand in solidarity with all queer people. The people attacking us do not see the difference in us in the way that we do. They see us all as queer. It doesn't matter to them whether we're gay, straight, gay, bi, trans, ace.
Mm-hmm.
We are queer to them. And so if we don't like fight together, then we're fucked, basically. um, but also, I think specifically the overlap with like bi and trans communities, I think there's always been like a very rich history of solidarity and community between us. If you look at the statistics and like the majority of trans people identify as like bi or pan or something like that. And also within the bi communities, we have kind of like much higher rates of non cisness than perhaps gay communities do, or like gay people do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I also think it comes back to this essentialism thing that we've talked about quite a lot, that the main arguments about biphobia are very similar to the main arguments about transphobia. And it's about going against what's being seen as your like essence as a man or a woman. I actually wrote an essay on this, which you can find on my Medium, which is called Bisexuality in the Threat Turf Politics,
Mm-hmm.
which talks about the essentialism overlap, and how it's kind of still the same fight of destabilizing gender and destabilizing patriarchy and the way in which kind of gender upholds patriarchy. That is very much why we're seeing like this backlash mainly against trans people, particularly here in the UK. It's really scary right now. And eventually it will come for all queer people, but the arguments
Yep.
against like trans and bi people are very, very similar.
Yep. Yeah, that was the exact article I had been reading that I was
Oh,
referencing.
cool.
And so if you want to check out that article, we will put it in the show notes, along with lots of other of Lo's writing and a link to the book. You can buy the book, by the way, and we'll put lots of other stuff in there. And I think that'll do it for us today. We've covered almost all the topics I wanted to, and it's been a lovely, fascinating Bi 2.0 discussion. So thank you so much for being here, Lo.
Oh my god, thank you so much for having me on. I love talking about bi politics. I love talking about deep fried bi politics. I'll talk about it for hours. So thank you for inviting me on just to do like my favorite thing, which is to talk about bisexuality.
Yay, I'm so glad. Me too. Thanks again, Lo. This was great.
Thank you so much.
Two Bi Guys is produced and edited by me, Rob Cohen, and it was created by me and Alex Boyd. Our logo art is by Caitlin Weinman. Our music is by Ross Mincer. We are supported by the Gotham, and we are part of the Zencastr Creator Network. Use promo code 2BiGuys to get 30% off your first 3 months of Zencastr. Thanks for listening to Two Bi Guys.